Here we are, it's October, and here's our local market roundup. Land Registry still lagging behind with the latest available stats. Figures for the year run up to the end of June, that's all they can report so far. They do reflect the post-pandemic market more clearly, however. There were 3,596 sales in the last year in Worcestershire, and that's 41% fewer than the 12 months previous. But remember, the previous year had been boosted by the stamp duty incentive that we no longer have the benefit of. However, they've got a change in mind. There were 542 sales in Malvern, and that's 26% lower. There were 1,626 sales in Worcester, and that was 37% down. And in Droitwich, it was 47% down with 365 sales. But the year-on-year factor is also affected by the new builds in the previous year to that. The increase in average sales prices over the last 5 years is significant. In Worcestershire, the average price has risen by 22%. In Malvern, it's gone by a whopping 26%. Worcester by 21% and Droitwich by 15%. Rental market locally, the average rent prices are as follows. Worcester's £776 per calendar month, in Droitwich it's £720 per calendar month, and in Malvern it's £828 per calendar month. Lettings pitch has been fluctuating over the last 12 months with an increase of 8% recorded in the average rent for Worcester. Flats let at an average of £621 per month in Droitwich, and that represents 42% of the properties that have been let out in the last 12 months. And I think that's had an impact on the overall average rent. At £720 per calendar month, this is actually 8.7% below the overall Worcestershire average of £789. In Malvern, the average monthly rent now sits at £828, which is an increase of over 18% in the last 12 months. Fairly significant growth there. Interest rates are rising, but we are not alone. The US Federal Reserve increased theirs by 0.75%. Their interest rate is now at 3 to 3.25. The European Central Bank increased by 0.75% as well, and their new interest rate's at 1.25. And we all know the UK Bank of England base rate was taken up by 0.5% to 2.25. It'd be nice to know the inflation in these areas. In the US, it's 8.3% currently, Germany 7.9%, France 5.9%, and in the UK 9.9%. Once again, mainstream media's latched onto the uncertainty and filmed our screens with doomsday scenarios. So our feeling about this market at the moment has been the same for a while. True sentiment to this market is ignore the headlines. Take advice. There's still over 2,600 mortgage rates out there to choose from. There's a high proportion of people in the market with no mortgages at all. So as they downsize, they won't be affected at all by the interest rates. So that's why we're seeing more stock come into the market. If you're climbing the ladder, the housing market's still going strong. We're finding that our offices are getting lots of offers on the properties that they're listing. You just need to take advice and make sure that the rate you're going for is going to be the same rate when you get your offer accepted. Talking about the national market, the government have raised the threshold at which stamp duty land tax is to be paid. It was at 125 and now it's up to 250. For first-time buyers, the threshold's been raised from 300,000 up to 425,000. At 15.5%, UK house price growth in the year to July was the strongest it's been since May 2003. The rise reflects how property prices a year ago were impacted by the stamp duty holiday, and month on month, prices rose by 2%. The average asking price of newly marketed properties fell in August by 1.3%. That is fairly typical, though, of August activity over the past 10 years. It does represent the first fall in 2022. On average, properties in July sold subject to contract in just 33 days, but they are still taking on average 136 days to go through. That's 4.5 months to complete a sale. Looking at the economy, so the government have announced the largest tax cutting budget since the late 80s in a major shift to economic policy. The government is aiming to actually reduce the tax burden to stimulate economic growth. The Bank of England have raised the base rate to 2.25%. That's the 7th consecutive rise. It was 0.5% rise, and that was lower than the 0.7% rise that most people were predicting. Current rate of inflation is at 9.9%. The UK economy grew by 0.2% in July, following a 0.6% fall in June. This level of growth was slightly below the 0.3% expected by economists. The Bank of England have warned, however, that we may already be in a recession, but remember, a recession is not necessarily a housing recession. So, looking at the national lettings market, at 3.4%, UK rental price growth in the year to August is at its strongest since records began in 2016. Rental prices continue to rise across much of the UK. The ONS index is based on both tenancy renewals and new tenancies. The government's launched a consultation into the introduction and enforcement of a decent home standard in the private rented sector, and this consultation will run until Friday the 14th of October this year. Tenant demand's continuing to rise, but actually the pace seems to be moderating slightly. So There's a lot going on in the world at the moment. There's a lot going on in the UK. Worcestershire seems to be a very, very strong part of the market in terms of house prices. We're seeing a lot of demand for properties that are coming to the market, and the rental market's flying as well. So there we have it. That's the end of our update for this month. Clearly, you might have your own questions. In times like this, you're going to need a good estate agent. You're probably going to need some good advice, and that's what we're trying to help with. We're trying to give you as much information as possible so you can make an informed decision on what you're planning to do. Don't let the press scare you. The market is moving at such a good pace. Not as quick as it was with the stamp duty incentives that were set up with the COVID times, but we're still moving at a great pace. So we hope to hear from you. If you have any questions, drop them in the comments box below or get in touch with the offices and we'll be happy to assist.